Okay. Well, I didn't know my newsletters would be an email blast would be so effective. I thought they would go into a void, but they did not tonight. So thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. Before I start the debate, just give a bit summary of the context in which this conversation is taking place. So each summer, AEI hosts what's called the Summer Honors Program, where anywhere between 220, 250 students come for 1 week seminars to really engage with the best of AEI scholarship and engage with some of the most important public policy debates in our civic life today. And within that group of 250 students, we also have 10 students who are members for the first time of our Summer Honors Academy. So they've joined us for all 4 weeks of the program. So joining their peers in 1 week courses and then also doing enrichment activities, war game, public policy simulations, conversations with leading thinkers and doers here in Washington. And as a kind of capstone of sorts for this opportunity, we had them engage in a debate today, modeled off of the Intelligence Squared debate format. Have any of you guys seen that before on YouTube? Excellent. So to give a brief summary of the AEI version of this debate, our teams will have opening speeches. Each will be speaking for 5 minutes. Then there will be a moderated exchange in this debate by moi. Then we will have a crossfire of sorts between the opposing teams, and then we'll have conclusions. So what makes this debate competitive, even if you're working for the more unpopular side of things in a given room, is that the winner is determined by who makes the most progress in changing the opinions of those who participate before and after the debate, as opposed to which resolution wins a plurality or majority of the votes. The question now is, how will I know what you guys think? Well, the first resolution, income inequality is a serious threat to the United States economy and society. Contestants, you cannot vote in this exchange. So please go to the URL you see here. We'll give you a couple moments. You can either answer agree, disagree, or undecided. And then we will use those results to figure out which team was most successful in changing kind of the opinions of the room. And while you do that, I'd like to introduce our participants tonight in the first debate on income inequality. On my far left, speaking in favor of the resolution, is Christopher Paludi. He's a rising junior at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. To my immediate left is Brendan Galvin. He is a rising junior also at Princeton University in Princeton. On my immediate right is Matthew Reed. He's a recent graduate of Pomona College and an incoming first-year law student at University of Chicago. Great. And Reagan Brady, on my far right, is a rising sophomore at Harvard University in Cambridge. All right. Was everyone able to complete the survey? Raise your hand. Most of you guys? Okay. Pretty much everyone. Finish up. Well, let's begin. So I will have 5 minutes going for each of these members to give an opening speech. And un moment. All right. Christopher, at your discretion.
While my partner will take up less visible but just as fundamental economic problems, I'm going to discuss income inequality as a socio-political problem. In this debate, you're going to argue the actual degree of inequality, and we're right to do so. But ultimately, this issue cannot be resolved by abstract deliberation. I'm going to focus first on the intentional, pernicious, and exclusionary wealth capture. I will then focus on social ills of mass relative deprivation and political frustration that result from the public perception of a new inequality, an inequality that is un-American. To be frank, I'm sympathetic to the argument that the best government is the one that does least. I'd like to follow that theory into practice, but in my research, I found this to be impossible. Unfortunately, the political reality of America today is that the issue of income inequality will continue to corrode our society through such ills as economic immobility and relative status anxiety. Income inequality does indeed pose a serious threat to the long-term health of American society and economy. Even more than its economic damages, it is already a political weapon wielded against moderate politics, it is already corrosive to social trust, and it threatens to distort the character of upcoming generations. Today, our economic growth is stable, and we're creating a lot of new jobs. But while our country's historical linkage between growth and equality is strong, AEI's James Pethokoukis recently wrote that, quote, America's elite communities are leaving the rest of the country behind. The nearly 7 million jobs added between 2000 and 2015 overwhelmingly flowed into the nation's most prosperous communities. Employment in the top fifth of zip codes rose by 6.5 million, 3 times as many jobs in the second best group, and 10 times as many in the mid-tier ones. So imagine how much more than the lowest. This is my first point. We're witnessing wealth capture. Our modern-day robber barons are not evil, but they're cheating. They're self-serving at the expense of most, and they distort a fair, open market. Equality of opportunity need not lead to equality of outcomes, but today's inequalities are often the result less of genuine meritocracy and fairness than the wealthy's conscious project to create themselves as a landed class, undercutting any claims to a fair, open society. Easily visible are zoning laws and excessive restrictions in housing development, whereby the privileged ensure that their neighborhoods and schools are not accessible to the less fortunate. This is only one of the many elite assaults on a fair meritocracy described by Brookings' Richard Reeves in Dream Hoarders. Today's inequality geographically, culturally, and materially separates elites from their fellow citizens. Here's the second point. Ultimately, we're not Homo economicus, but instead Homo socialis, social animals who care more for our well-being relative to others. Hence, the poor public perception of general welfare is explained by a critical social mass of individuals' relative deprivation. After President Obama raised the profile of the issue of economic inequality, Bernie Sanders truly weaponized it. Quote, wealth and income inequality is the great moral issue of our time, the great economic issue of our time, and the great political issue of our time. While I don't agree with Bernie Sanders on many things, if this is to be tomorrow's politics, something simply must be done today. First, the increasing hypersalience of agency-denying rhetoric regarding classifying economic inequality and Americans' inability to rise up even the lowest rungs of the social ladder, when seen alongside the decreasing percentage of Americans who self-identify as middle class, demonstrate that while common Americans have discovered their agency over the political party system, as demonstrated by Sanders and Trump, their concerns aren't addressed. Politicians seem only want to win, and government hardly governs. Rather than good governance that brings us forward together, the future seems to promise only further division and Pyrrhic war that destroys society. I'm now going to conclude. Irving Kristol once said that there is no alternative economic system to capitalism. Everything else is distribution, which is to say, any modification to or alternative to capitalism is simply politics. But he wrote in 1970 that, quote, far from having been a capitalist Republican community with shared values and a quite unambiguous claim to the title of a just order, the United States became a free, democratic society where the will to success and privilege was severed from its moral moorings. 1970. Imagine what he would say about 2018. Imagine what he would say if we saw that we were to do nothing, if he saw that we were to let the problem worsen. We must take political responsibility for the public good. Politics is the Aristotelian name for how we order goods in a community. A government cannot take a laissez-faire attitude to its own people.
10 seconds.
There's plenty of work we must do in the margins, not only for the marginalized, but also for the majority of the country who do not feel prioritized. All I'm saying is that everyone should have a chance, that capitalism should be fair, open, and meritocratic, and that elites should not benefit themselves at the expense of others.
Excellent. So Matt, tell us why you don't think inequality is that big a deal.
Sure. Well, let me begin by just setting forth kind of what our opponents must establish in order not to lose this debate. Okay. It's not enough for my friends in the opposition to show you that income inequality exists in this country, and nor is it sufficient for them to show that income inequality is unnaturally large or widening. At minimum, the opposition must demonstrate a clear connection of causation, not mere correlation, between income inequality in America and its supposed ill effects. That is what they must show. And they must show that these effects of inequality threaten the long-term social and economic health of the most dynamic and most dominant nation on the planet. Finally, they must convince us to discount the manifest but underreported improvements in quality of life experienced by America's poor and middle class during the same period that many of my opponents' persuasion deride as the new Gilded Age. It is often argued that income inequality in this country is a threat because it is increasing at such a rapid rate. It is true that income inequality has increased over the past few decades, but it has not increased as much as some have argued. The measures of income inequality that are most often cited in the popular press, in fact, ignore many of the economic resources of the poor, such as those obtained from government programs, while downplaying the real contributions the wealthy make by taxes to our safety net system. Measures of income inequality that correct these statistical problems, in fact, find that the increase in income inequality between 1980 and 2011 is less than half of the commonly cited figure, at only about 19%. Not bad for about 30 years. Furthermore, even on the flawed traditional measures, income inequality is no longer increasing. In fact, when we account for cash payments and transfers from government safety net programs to the poor, inequality on the traditional measure has in fact decreased over the past decade. So even if one concedes that income inequality is a problem, what we see in the facts is that it is a problem which is no longer worsening, and in fact may have reached a turning point and will decline on its own. That increases in income inequality have stalled since the recession presents a stubborn wrinkle for the opposition. Consider this. Though income inequality has remained the same or decreased over the past decade, it has transformed from an arcane, undiscussed political non-issue into the golden calf of pundits and politicians. How could this be? The answer is obvious. The 2008 recession was quite severe. It shocked Americans at all income levels, and it took years for the economy to recover. In some places, the jobs still have not returned. But these are absolute deprivations. These are not relative ones. In other words, few seem concerned about income inequality at all, a question of relative deprivation, until all had suffered the absolute deprivation of a significant economic recession. My point here is simple. The opposition will tell you that income inequality causes severe social dislocations, that it creates disconnection and division in what should be a united polity. They will attempt to convince you that life is much worse for lower-income Americans simply because their incomes have not grown as rapidly as those of Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or a fancy lawyer at a top law firm. But these are strange arguments which ignore or misdiagnose the real problems at work. The absolute deprivation suffered by many during the recession and that recession's enduring effects deserve the blame for the social ills that my opponents would prefer to attribute to income inequality. You don't need data to know that Americans would rather live in 2005 with rising income inequality and broad-based economic growth than in 2008, when income inequality declined sharply as a bloody stock market shredded the wealth and capital of the top earning quintile. Yet even if we stipulate that income inequality is large and increasing, it is not a major social or economic threat to this country. For in spite of rising income inequality, life for Americans of every income quintile has improved dramatically over the past 30 years on nearly every single important measure. Crime rates have dropped. Divorce rates have dropped. Unwanted pregnancies are down. Gender inequality is down. Internet access is nearly universal. Poverty has decreased dramatically. Inflation-adjusted income growth has been strong across the board for decades. Virtually all of America's poor have access to good quality food and the essentials of modern life, such as air conditioning, microwaves, and washing machines. These clearly represent significant and concrete changes for the better in American standard of living. But for our opponents to prevail in this debate, it must be the case that the vast changes for the better on all of these aforementioned measures, all of them, are irrelevant, outweighed by the mere fact that some have seen more income growth than others.
Excellent. Ready, Brendan?
Yeah. So while Chris has clearly demonstrated the potency of income inequality in disrupting the fabric of our society, there remain strong, solely prudential considerations warning against rising income inequality. The rising inequality not only threatens exceptional features of American life, but also threatens our historic strengths in economic growth and productivity. It is well known that the top 50% earners account for basically all federal income taxes. According to the most recent data, the top 50% paid 97.3% of all individual taxes, while the bottom half accounted for the remaining 2.7%. But even this division of halves does not tell the real story about wealth disparity. Splitting this upper group, we see that the top 25% of earners account for 86.8% of all income taxes. Moreover, the top 5% remain responsible for the majority, paying 60%, while the top 1% pay 39.5%, and the minuscule population of the top 0.1% accounts for 19.9%. The most concerning aspect of this skewed distribution is the manner in which it is changing. The household incomes of the top 1% have grown 275% from 1979 to 2007 and expanded their relative responsibility for federal income tax revenue. Meanwhile, the top quintile of society, excluding the top 1%, only experienced growth of 65%, while the middle three quintiles grew 37% and the bottom quintile 18%, diminishing their share of income taxes paid. This pattern makes America increasingly dependent on the very top of our society for wealth creation and revenue. And to be straightforward, today's government needs more revenue. In January 2016, our national debt was $13.6 trillion. That was 75% of GDP that year. Social Security present pressing fiscal challenges. We also face looming demands from climate change, security obligations in an era of renewed great power conflict, and pressing needs in social capital, infrastructure, and education, just naming a few. With the current distribution of income, America is increasingly dependent on the progress of the very top to drive growth and meet these demands for revenue. This cohort is already remarkably efficient and firing on all cylinders. Instead of continuing the expansion of our reliance on a small group already working at full steam, America would be much better served and healthier if a wide range of the American population, which is ripe for growth, reemerged as a source of financial strength. The current and growing reliance on a small number of increasingly distant top earners presents a number of difficulties. Our national financial issues cannot be solved without either a massive increase in taxes, which under present conditions will inherently fall on the elite already responsible for the majority of taxes, or a strong upswing in GDP, a difficult and problematic task itself. Increasing the tax burden on the wealthiest Americans could ultimately prove ineffective. One of Reagan's economic advisors, Art Laffer, described a concave curve that showed the relationship between tax revenue and tax rate. Once tax rates exceed a certain point, revenue begins to drop. This lost revenue could be the product of a drop in production caused by taxes or increased tax evasion, because rich people are smart, after all. So even if larger taxes on the wealthiest Americans can finance some projects in the short term, dependence on the top will prove inadequate once it reaches a critical level. The expansion of income inequality pushes American society further in direction of a vicious split between makers and takers, to quote Mitt Romney. This scenario not only poisons relationships between elites and ordinary Americans, but appears financially dangerous. If you subscribe to the Keynesian thought, the fundamental heart of growth is the spending power of the middle class to drive consumption and increase aggregate demand. Strong inequality stunts growth because the middle class collapses and consumption falls with it. Our opponents may claim that the productive top can then drive growth through their own talents in entrepreneurship, innovation, and allocation of capital. But this is slightly misleading because the disappearance of the middle class harms small businesses, which contribute massively to GDP, and diminish the overall economic competition essential for driving innovation and growth. Moreover, if the escalating wealth of the top is more the product of financialization and rent-seeking than productive entrepreneurship, then today's inequalities are not natural, healthy products of Adam Smith's capitalism, but rather the result of a cultural shift away from emphasizing making things with a preference to make more money from money. Expanding the middle class, in many ways a paraphrase of reducing income inequality, will have positive effects on both the supply and demand sides of growth. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development predicted that the cumulative growth rates in the U.S. would have been 6 to 9 percentage points higher in 2014 had income inequality not widened. This dynamic points to a twofold alternative. Decreased levels of income inequality will not only assist in raising GDP, but naturally provide a larger taxable population. By increasing such a base, we can ensure that the immense fiscal challenges of the coming decades will not fall on the shoulders of an increasingly elite, resentful group, but rather to be distributed across the population in a manner that promotes stability and sustained growth. Therefore, the current road of income inequality leads us away from the healthiest and most prosperous America that we could otherwise achieve.
Excellent. Right on time. Great. And then the last speech before our first exchange. Reagan, are you ready?
Yeah. All right. As Matthew presented in his speech, the measurement of income inequality does not accurately present the gap between the wealthy, middle class, and poor relative to other metrics. Yet, even if income inequality is accepted to be a serious and concrete issue, I will explain in this speech that it portends no serious economic consequences and, in fact, acts as a positive byproduct of our capitalist economy through spurring innovation and creating value for the average American consumer like you or me. First, income inequality is not the economic problem that some may argue it to be. While it may be argued that income inequality has a detrimental effect on labor, as it discourages workers by diminishing the belief in social mobility, decreasing incentives to work hard to achieve higher incomes, this is not the case. We argue that increasing levels of economic discontent stem not from disparities in earnings between the poor and the rich, but rather from factors that directly affect workers, such as lack of jobs, low pay, limited skills in education, or wage stagnation, none of which are a direct result of income inequality, but rather they are problems in and of themselves. If income inequality were to rise from the falling wages of low-wage workers, for example, this could adversely affect American society. But even so, income inequality is not the cause of this societal problem, but rather it is the symptom of one, in this case, diminishing wages for low-wage workers. It is true that income inequality is larger in the United States than in the rest of the developed world, but it is larger here for several positive systemic reasons. First, the U.S. has a deeply entrepreneurial culture, and our economic freedom, coupled with this entrepreneurial spirit, enables the Facebooks and Googles of the world to thrive and to pull many Americans, from Mark Zuckerberg to his armies of software engineers, into the top 1%, while providing services from which regular people, regardless of their economic means, may derive enormous value. To support this, Yale University economist William D. Nordhaus has estimated that only 2.2% of the gains from innovation are captured by the innovators themselves, with the rest of the gains going to consumers. The Hoover Institution exemplifies this point by explaining that even if Microsoft founder Bill Gates had retained 10% of his returns from the creation of the personal computer, his entrepreneurial spirit created more than $7 trillion in value for the rest of the consumers like you or me. Second, we have an economy that handsomely rewards brilliant ideas. The Hoover Institution stresses the importance of incentives to generate wealth, concluding that, quote, high taxes on highly productive people take the wealth out of their hands, where much of it likely would have been used to finance more pro-consumer innovation and productivity, and puts it in the hands of government bureaucracies. That simple transfer of wealth, independent of the effect on incentives, makes a society worse off, unquote. Thus, there is more value for the progenitors of great ideas to capture here, in the tech capital of the world, than in any other place such as Europe, Japan, or elsewhere in the developed world where barriers to entry are high and the benefits of success are swallowed up by high rates of taxation. Beyond simply this, AEI scholar Edward Conard explains that having a large income distribution creates incentives for highly skilled individuals to take risks, spurring innovation and fueling increased demand, leading to a benefit for everyone in society. Conard concludes that, quote, more equal societies work less, invest less, grow more slowly, and ultimately leave everyone less well off, unquote. The system of capitalism has created a free economy where individuals are able to rise to the top, pulling others along with them. On balance, the metric of income inequality is not the societal evil it is presented to be. It is beneficial to economic growth at best and an irrelevant metric at its worst. We have demonstrated that income inequality is a profoundly incomplete measure, which does nothing to account for the actual standards of living in the United States. Since it is only a nominal variable, the only effect it may have on economic growth lies in altering the perceptions and attitudes of the labor force, effects which we believe to be largely beneficial, not harmful, in our free economy. Through motivating enterprising individuals to strive for the incomes they can achieve and allowing the fruits of their labor to be enjoyed by everyone in the American economy, it is clear that income inequality is an inherent component of a free market, a byproduct of living and participating in the United States economy. To conclude, Matthew and I strongly believe that income inequality does not pose a serious threat to the long-term health of American society and economy, and we affirm the value of capitalism and free enterprise in improving livelihoods of individuals across the country and around the world.
Excellent. Are you guys ready to go?
So I also...
Yes.
Yes.
You guys a 2-minute break, but I'd like to go ahead if you all are ready.
Okay.
All right, great. Okay, so I will start with questions.
Oh, sure. Never mind. I was going to jump in.
Just to speed things up a bit for the audience. All right, so my first question is for Brendan. You note the existence of rent-seeking and financialization
Yeah.
in our economy. Could you give an example or some examples of what exactly you mean by that phrase and why that's a problem?
So basically, financialization is the economy becoming more dominated by the finance industry rather than production itself. So we've actually seen a massive increase of this in the recent years. So in 1970, 10% of GDP was in the finance industry, 20% by 2010. And then even Wall Street itself was 10% profits in 1982, and then 40% of all corporate profits in 2003. So basically, this is a transition of the economy from making things, as was traditionally in an entrepreneurial, like the classic American, like we think of Carnegie's and Rockefellers. They're creating, they're being productive. That's the classic American entrepreneur. But what we're witnessing is a transition of the American economy towards finance, which is really just creating money from money. It's not creating a product itself. And that isn't really growth, as we've seen.
Great. So kind of for the con, on that note, do you really think it's accurate to kind of, when you're trying to explain who the 1, 5, 10% of the United States is, to evoke images of Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, all these kind of Silicon Valley figures that both the left and the right, admire to some extent? I mean, isn't that cohort of the American elite also full of people who have made their money or their finances in ways that we would not consider entirely savory or productive in the long term?
Well, certainly there are a lot of people that, I mean, the 1% is a whole lot of people,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're forgetting it's, a few million people in this country. It's a lot of doctors, it's a lot of lawyers, it's a lot of people that work in finance and things like that. But I do just want to touch on one thing about financialization. So one of the big arguments that's often made about income inequality is like, well, there's all these incomes that are being generated because in these sort of unvaluable ways. Like, there's some guy on Wall Street crunching numbers and it's actually worthless to the average person. So let's take a practice that some of you are probably familiar with from The Big Short, which is the tranching and packaging of loans, right? And that was to blame for the mortgage crisis because basically a lot of bad loans were put together in these packages and made to appear safe so that, and then the market collapsed because no one knew what the actual value of these things were. But in fact, packaging and tranching loans, which may seem to be something that is only for the Wall Street boys or whatever you might say, is in fact something that's good for consumers. Because when you package and tranche loans and you're able to sell them on the secondary market, banks are able to get these debts off their books and sell them to secondary buyers. So it reduces their risk, which means that they can offer lower interest rates to consumers. So this is something that maybe you don't see on the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but it's definitely not something you see there in 2008 or 2007, but it's certainly something that actually does happen on the ground. And so it's important to recognize that there is tremendous value being created here, and that the kinds of people that are investing in these securities are retirees and people that are actually depending on this for a fixed income. So the economy is far more complex than, there's a couple 20-year-olds sitting around and just plugging numbers in to a computer sequence. This is actually having an effect on the economy and real people, and it's good for them. And we need that kind of work in the economy. And the mere fact that they're getting paid for that kind of work at the level that they're being paid indicates that they have a certain kind of value, unless we think wages are absolutely no indicator of exactly how valuable someone's labor is.
Great. So, Christopher, one of your arguments seems to be that it's not just the existence of inequality that matters, but simply the perception. And even if our opponents might make a credible argument for why inequality is exaggerated, we as political leaders and as statesmen need to take those feelings of resentment and status anxiety seriously. But wouldn't you say part of statesmanship is not giving in to the emotions and feelings of the masses, the hoi polloi, if those feelings aren't necessarily justified by the data?
So I don't think that showing people the data about how they receive money from the government and are they then able to buy TVs convinces them that their kids are going to be in a better financial position to where they won't have to take money from the government to buy TVs. Being able to purchase things because the government gives you money doesn't make you feel good about yourself. It doesn't make you feel like you have agency. And feelings of agency are directly causal, in fact, which to address Matthew's first point, to feelings of well-being. Imagine if you knew that for the rest of your life, you'd have to take SNAP benefits or other kinds of welfare to buy TVs. That's okay if you think your kids are getting a good education. But what if you can't move into a better area with a better school? What if you know that they too are going to have to receive welfare for the rest of their lives, and their children are going to have to receive welfare for the rest of their lives? Because income inequality is not about how much people are jealous of others. Status anxiety isn't jealousy. Status anxiety is feeling that your kids and your kids' kids are not going to have a better life than you.
So Reagan, I think one of the strongest arguments against inequality is kind of the idea of complex inequality developed by Michael Walzer that basically says we're concerned about inequality in money not for its own sake, but because that power can basically transfer into other areas and undermine important values in that sector. And an example of that would obviously be in politics. So, if you crunch the numbers from 2016, a very small number of specific families accounted for at least the majority, if not a strong majority, of the total campaign contributions made to both parties and, super PACs and political campaigns. So shouldn't we be concerned, even if we're not concerned about how inequality affects the market, how inequality in wealth will affect our democracy and its credibility?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know is that every time there is an important political election or campaign, we see huge amounts of donations being made, as you said, on both sides of the issues. It would be different if one side was receiving vastly more campaign finance donations than the other, but that's simply not the case. And the issue that you bring up really points to the underlying issue of campaign finance laws. This can be reformed, and this is not a direct result of inequality in itself. So we believe that these two issues are very distinct. But just touching back on what Chris mentioned before about how the perceptions of inequality can be damaging in themselves, I'd like to share that over 80% of people in China believe that their children will be better off than them, while only a third of the Americans believe the same is true. Yet we know China has much higher levels of income inequality than the United States. Meanwhile, France, which is a much more equal society, only 10% of people believe that their children will be better off than them. So what we see is that these social perceptions are actually what is allowing people to realize that they do have agency. Living in a society with large amounts of inequality, in fact, leads people to believe that they have social mobility and that is possible. And that is also supported by the statistics, which show that if you live in the bottom quintile of American society, you have a 60% chance to move out of that quintile over your life today. So we see that social mobility is very much alive and well.
Can I just say something to that? Would you say that it's not the
Sorry,
seven...
we're going to do the Q&A later on.
Can I then respond to that? Because I actually
respond,
I just
but
have
don't ask a
data.
question.
Okay, I want to ask a question. I'm just going to say that if your country like China is growing at 70%, or 7% year by year, you know that your kids are going to have a better life. That doesn't mean that you move up relative to other people in your society, or that you feel better about your own life. And I would hesitate to say that we should model after China.
Right.
Or that
Brent.
inequality is a permanent condition then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Brennan, so a question for you. I think your opponents would probably concede that inequality could be a problem if it's a reflection not of what the wealthy are doing, but the problems we're seeing among the middle class in terms of education, skills, social capital, productivity, and so on. So could you maybe give a causal claim for why the rising success and fiscal dominance of the top is causing stagnation for those in the middle?
Well, I think a lot of it is actually just crowding out because wealth is being accumulated at the top and is fundamentally drawing it away from the middle class. So that's basically just shifting the distribution and diminishing the middle class and collapsing it. And that kind of gets into a spiral of kind of pushing more towards financialization, decreasing aggregate demand, and that just kind of promotes and promotes and promotes until it just kind of get to the point that we are at today.
Right. Matt, so it seems like a lot of your claim here is that inequality is somehow an essential engine to building a dynamic, wealthy, decent society. But if I look at countries like in Scandinavia, Japan, Germany, a lot of these nations seem to have pretty good, if not better, outcomes compared to the United States in terms of health, mortality, mobility, and so on. They've gone through the same experiences that might cause inequality, globalization, trade, what have you, but they don't have the inequality that we do. So I guess how do those countries kind of complicate the claim that inequality is essential for building a dynamic, prosperous society?
I don't think they complicate the claim because, I always think it's funny when people compare us to Scandinavia, because it's like, let's compare the most diverse nation on earth with, hundreds of different people of ethnic backgrounds and hundreds of different religious backgrounds, to a nation that basically has one race of people and that basically everybody knows who each other is, and very small nation. So I think it's difficult to make those kinds of comparisons, because it's vastly easier to manage an economy and to feel the kinds of social cohesion that are important to form the kind of the broad-based success that these countries are able to produce.
Great.
I would say that you just compared our society to China, though.
We're going to give
it's
you
not
guys
exactly similar.
you have a second to start getting in.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes. You all can stretch and chat. Give you all 2 minutes to get your questions ready, and then you can have at it.
Enterprising individuals. And that's
All right, we're going to get back started again. I'll let you all ask the first question.
So I'm going to take this one. So Los Angeles, California, where I'm from, used to be zoned for 10 million people. Now it's zoned for 4.6. You cannot say that fewer people live in Los Angeles now than they used to. So this is a demonstration, in my opinion, of elites rezoning their area to keep out people who want to move there for the sake of the economic opportunity. What would you guys respond? What plausible reason could wealthy people have to rezone their community so that fewer people can live there?
Well, fewer people live in Detroit now than they used to. You have any idea why that might be?
Well, did they rezone Detroit, or
Because of the collapse of American manufacturing.
because of financialization of the economy and that leaving jobs?
Well, I think that there could be any number of answers to that question. But
what about
you
these,
need
though?
to show the people here that the answer to that question is income inequality. I am not personally privy to the economic situation of Los Angeles. I know I hated the traffic when I was there. But that doesn't mean that I know much about what the particular economic situation is there. But granted, I think it's difficult to, if you have to show that the literal income difference between people is what is causing these social dislocations and economic problems to which you're pointing, right? You can't just say there are economic problems and there are social dislocations, and it just so happens that income inequality has increased. That is a correlation. You are showing no causal connection whatsoever.
I'm not arguing that today's ills are caused directly by me one making much less money than another. I'm arguing that in the future, income inequality and the rich preserving their riches at the expense of people who want to move up the ladder is a serious political, social threat to our society, because the poor become so frustrated that they eventually want to tax the wealthy so much that it divides society. I'm not arguing for redistribution. I'm arguing that we should want a society where nobody wants to take from anybody else because they feel that they can earn their success because they have agency.
All right. Con, do you have a question?
Oh, yes. So,
Well, I was just going to keep going.
Okay.
okay, so my first question for you is, can you explain how there is an inequality of opportunities in the United States today, and how that is driven itself by income inequality?
Yeah, and from that I'll question you. Basically, so nearly 1 in 4 American children right now are growing up in poverty. That means that they have very limited access to education, and beyond that are malnourished and just unhealthy. I mean, that itself is being denied opportunities. I mean, like, if you're not going to school, you don't have an opportunity. And so I think down the line, a generation or two from now, that's a serious threat to the economy. The fact that 1/4 of children are uneducated, basically. So do you think that condition isn't a threat to the long-term health of the American economy and American society?
No, I completely agree that is definitely...
But that's the product of income inequality.
Can you explain that causal...
Because they don't have money.
You're talking about absolute levels of wealth. If every poor person in this country were a millionaire, we wouldn't be talking about any of this, right? This wouldn't matter. Would we be talking about, well, gosh, they can't drive around in yachts? So, this is a really serious problem.
In a society with complete with very low levels of income inequality, such as Kazakhstan, where the GDP per capita is $26,000. How do you think that compares to the standard of living?
There's also Sweden, and their GDP is higher than ours.
If
So
we can't compare
evidently-
ourselves to Sweden, we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
Evidently, we can see that there's no causal link between levels of inequality and standards of living. Both of these are not correlated, but they're independent metrics.
If the value
So you
of
don't-
your,
you don't-
hold on. If you buy a home using your income, and the value of your home, because the value of your income is super high, then the quality of your school is also going to be pretty high because it's going to be well funded by the value of your home, i.e. property taxes. And if you're keeping the poor out of that area by driving rents up, again, LA is now less than half of the people can live there than they used to. That's rent seeking. And you're using more and more money to pay for your housing, less and less money to pay for your SAT prep for your kids, and they can't go to learn the finance skills at the schools that they're not able to afford, and that traps people below a certain threshold where they for generations have to keep receiving welfare from the government, which really destroys the social trust between people and the feelings of agency that you can climb up the ladder. We just
I
want an
absolutely
America.
agree that that is a widespread problem. I think some of my classmates who were in the education seminar last week would agree with me that this is an issue with the education system and the way that we allow our children to decide what school to go to. But we do not agree that this is an issue with income inequality in itself, but rather an issue that can be remedied through enacting better policies.
Right, and also I'm perplexed as to how you propose to solve income inequality because you claim to be against redistribution, because that is exactly how you would fix income inequality. That is exactly what Sweden and all
Here's
these,
the thing.
all these
Looking
wonderful
for solutions,
Scandinavian
you need to first acknowledge
paradises
that it's a
do.
problem. You got to acknowledge it's a problem first before you go running around looking for solutions.
But I'm not convinced by you that it is a problem.
I
You
have
haven't
some solutions.
You haven't shown
I have
me
some
that
stuff.
there is something uniquely problematic about the fact that some people make a lot of money and some people don't. You haven't shown a causal link between the people making a lot of money and the people not. The fact is that this economy is not just a pie where everybody gets a little slice of it. The fact is the people at the top are producing enormous value. They're baking pies for the American public.
No, they're taking-
and you
they're
don't want
taking-
them to eat.
So there's an old story. There's this philosopher named Bertrand de Duvenel, and he said that communism is a static pot with equal spoons. Nobody wants that. Capitalism is an expanding pot with unequal spoons, which is what you're arguing. What I'm trying to argue is that if I'm a spoon, I want my children to be a bigger spoon. But if more and more spoons can't have bigger spooned children, those spoons are going to want to take that bigger ladle from a bigger spoon, and all the spoons should be getting along in one social fabric, one pot. But if little spoons don't have access and their spoons don't have access to that big pot, they're going to want to tip the whole thing over and pour it out. And that's not good for American society or economy.
Can we just take a moment?
It's not about whether Mark Zuckerberg makes more money than me. It's about when I go and have a child, that child having a better life, because I am sure as heck going to fight people to make sure he does, regardless of whether or not Mark Zuckerberg is creating Facebook.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying completely. And
Good.
I mean, you kind of lost me there in the middle, but like I get the general idea. But anyway, so how do you respond to the fact that social mobility is very much alive and well in the United States, and that if you're in the lower quintile of society and you receive a college education, you have an 82% chance of moving out of that quintile in the course of your lifetime?
Per the Brookings Institution, in 1940, those born had about a 90% chance of expectations to grow up to experience higher incomes than their parents. But among those born in the 1980s, the proportion was only 50%. So if 40% fewer people in American society have an expectation of having higher incomes than their parents, I question what you were actually asserting here. Because that's a much larger percentage of America than a quintile.
And you also need to look at like how percentages work. So you're saying you're looking at the lower quintile, and you're saying of that quintile, the ones that go to college, they have an 82% chance of being higher.
Okay,
yeah,
so
but what percentage goes to college?
Right, and
you were just talking about how 1 in 4 are so severely disadvantaged. Like that, you're just skipping over a statistical link.
Reagan?
Okay, so I think the fact of this matter is you guys are discussing the chance that static relative incomes will be greater than what they were before. We're discussing in more terms of inequality by looking at society in terms of quintiles. We see that 60% of those in the bottom quintile, regardless of whether they go to college or not, will move out of this bottom fifth of society in the course of their lifetime. So it's relative social mobility is still very much possible, even if absolute social mobility is decreasing in terms of actual absolute income.
And would you be happier if more of the wealthy were dropped out of the upper quintile? Like, should we?
That's
should we
what,
institute
that's
a
what
government
social
program
mobility is. For some to go up, some have to go down.
Right, but what?
Yeah,
but the point that we attempted to make in our speeches was that absolute growth for everyone the absolute status and living standards of the entire American public have increased dramatically over time. And you would prefer to ignore all of that. In order for your argument to succeed, you need to prove to us that these quintile measurements, which are solely, talking about where everybody is relative to everyone else, this is the only thing that matters. We have to ignore the fact that the bottom quintile's income growth has been 30% since 1967. And we have to ignore the fact that there's been massive income growth across the board. And we have to ignore the fact that poverty has actually dramatically increased.
Great. Last word.
Yeah, but we're looking towards the future. And right now, basically, we don't have any destruction that drives growth. There's Schumpeterian destruction, which is a tenet of capitalism, that basically you free up resources when they're ineffective and let the effective entrepreneurs take hold of that. And we don't have that nowadays because those who are in control set up a system so that they can't get out of it.
Great. All right. 2 minutes again to write your conclusions and get ready to think about how you're going to vote in the second round. Okay. Well, it seems like intense debates are already breaking out of the tables, and that's exactly what we want to see. Since at AEI and as a department, we do believe in the competition of ideas and robust debate about the challenges facing our republic, we are going to close this debate with 2-minute remarks by each of the contestants. Ready?
So the financialization of the economy means that a lot of jobs are being created and there's a lot of growth. Absolute incomes are rising, but most of the jobs are being created in high-income areas like New York, Los Angeles, which is, again, half the people are allowed to live there now. And if you're trapped outside of those areas, you can't find work because you can't afford to move there where the jobs are because you don't have any money and everything is so high. And so for generations, you are going to be trapped. Imagine you live today in Arkansas or Alabama. You have a lot of dignity. You believe you're worth something. But you and generations before you and generations after you seem trapped receiving checks from the government, which is humiliating. It shouldn't have to work like that. And of course, we have programs like the EITC and SNAP that are good, and we should expand them. But you should be able to climb out of that. And if so many people today have a higher absolute purchasing power because the government gives them money, that's great, and I'm glad we do. But I'd rather not have to. And I'd rather not have to give their kids money, and so would they. And so if we're going to tear each other apart so that we can tax the 1% higher, so that we can give people more money, that might happen, but it's going to put us at each other's throats, and I'd rather not see it. I'd rather us prudentially take this problem seriously and acknowledge that people feel this way for a reason. No one's lying to them. They experience this. It's not like people are swooping in from Scandinavia and saying, woo, we're better. It's people here feeling frustrated because their grandparents fought in war and their parents had a better life than their grandparents, but they don't have a better life than their parents, and they don't think their kids will either. And what does that say? Does it say that there's a problem? I think it does. And they think it does, and they're going to vote that way. And that's the question at hand. How are they going to vote? Will we be at each other's throats? And aren't we already?
Excellent. Matthew?
Mm-hmm. So my opponent just laid out a very compelling case as to why demographic slowdown of an aging country is very difficult. And it causes some very difficult economic issues that are hard to address. But these are not... He's not speaking to the central issue of this debate, which is income inequality. He has not shown you, and our opponents have not shown you during this debate, why it is the case that we should ignore the enormous absolute income growth and the absolute growth in standards of living. That's quite apart from government transfer payments, but that actually is due to rising incomes that we've seen over the past 30 years. And let me remind you again that income inequality has in fact either decreased or stayed the same since 2008 and the 2007-8 recession, right? Are we living in a better time now than we were before the recession when income inequality was higher? Do we feel better about how things are in this country? No, we're more worried about these problems even though income inequality is no longer increasing. And I think that's very interesting, and it speaks to the fact that we're trying to deal with more substantive ground level economic issues that don't have anything to do with actual income inequality. Income inequality is not causing these anxieties. The fact that people are worried about income inequality is because income inequality has become the buzzword that we slap onto all of these problems in order to make ourselves feel like we have a good way to solve them. And I'll just say one other thing about the wealthy hoarding economic growth. The wealthy are not hoarding economic growth. The fact is that if you look at Facebook and Twitter and all these, I would argue Twitter has not created much value because I hate Twitter. I think it's the worst social media platform ever created. But simply because I believe that does not mean that it has not created enormous value for political communities across the world organizing revolutions and for people that are trying to develop new ways of communicating and to band together to sell things and buy things on the internet. It's amazing what these things have created, and we should have more of that and not punish it.
Great.
Chicago's getting a kid who can talk. I'll say that. But I'm kind of just concerned generally, not about right now per se, but just looking to the future. We talked about the growth of the top and how that's creating wealth for everyone, basically. But it really remains the top that is growing. It's 275% since 1979. And that is pretty isolated. And when you continue to rely on that top group to finance everything that we have to deal with today, it's just a very bad situation. So basically, our deficit's going to increase. Interest rates will rise because of that. I don't think that's a situation that anyone really wants. And then we're gonna have to struggle to pay off welfare, Social Security, all these things that are just looming, and all these issues are just going to be on the shoulders of the elites, the top 1%. That is growing massively because of all the things that you're advocating. So income inequality, even if you want to dismiss it as a problem today, I think moving forward it is a massive problem, and we saw that with education as well. When the bottom part, who's suffering under income inequality, is not going to be able to rise up. They're not going to be able to fulfill that dream that we've been talking about of creating and doing and just fulfilling the American dream. It's just much, much harder to do. And that's something that, quite honestly, as someone who's benefited from the American dream, terrifies me. And just looking forward, I think under the current circumstances, it's kind of tough to be positive, especially if we continue this track where we're just super dependent. And it's going to be very difficult when we're super dependent on this one group, and they're going to start resenting everyone, as Chris said. And I think that's a bad split to have in America, and it's fundamentally un-American to have no hope.
Reagan, last word.
All right. I'd like to just pick up where my opponent left off, where he says that it's tough to be positive in these times. It certainly is for the French, where less than 10% of the population believes that their children will live a life better than their own, with levels of inequality much lower than that in the United States, where 1/3 of Americans believe that their children will improve beyond themselves. So I think that income inequality, as we've demonstrated, does not have these damaging perceptions that harm the economy, as our opponents have repeatedly asserted throughout their case. So the second main issue that they have repeatedly led us to try to believe is that income inequality is leading to denial of opportunities for individuals across our society. Yet the fact of the matter is that social mobility exists. 60% of those in the bottom quintile of society will improve their relative position. A relative metric is much more applicable to this debate than an absolute one, as our opponents keep trying to tell you. So beyond simply this, we see that income inequality is what's leading to increases in economic gains for all Americans Americans across the board. Let me bring you back to the statistic I mentioned earlier in this debate that innovators only retain 2% of the gains that they receive from their innovations and their entrepreneurial spirit. This is something that's only possible in this American capitalistic society where individuals can be rewarded for the gains that they bring to others. In a society that is focused on taxation and redistribution of wealth, there will be no incentive for these individuals to keep creating these vastly beneficial products that help bring everybody in society up. Finally, I would like to just say that a lot of the issues that our opponents have been bringing up throughout this debate are systemic issues that can be resolved. That's why we live in a democracy. That's why campaign finance laws can be reformed. That's why zoning laws can be reformed. We live in a democracy and we live in a capitalist economy where individuals can be rewarded for their innovations, and where individuals are all benefited from the growth of others.
Right.
Thank you.
Round of applause to all the contestants. Okay, and now you vote. So let us know what you think. We're going to transition. We're going to have a 5-minute break. Feel free to use the restrooms on 1 or G1. You have to head out, no worries. I still think we have some pizza and sodas left, and we're going to transition to our foreign policy conversation in just a moment. Great job. All right, we are going to transition to the second and final debate of the evening. It's wonderful to see how many of you have been willing to stay for the second round. Some of you are required to be here, but thank you for all those who are continuing with us. Hope to get some more silverware analogies in this conversation. So the next topic, we are shifting to another policy area, one that relates to much of the scholarship at the American Enterprise Institute. The promotion of human rights and democracy abroad, including through the use of military intervention and economic sanctions, should be a fundamental American national interest. That is a lot, but our teams have prepared for that. So head over to surveymonkey.com/r/FDP1. I'll give you all a minute. And as you do that, I will introduce our panelists and our moderator. So on the far left, Rachel Bradley, Rising Junior at the College of Charleston. Alexander Sikorsky, Rising Junior at Yale University. Sarah Wapner, Rising Senior at the University of Toronto. Daniel Clay, recent graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. Go Longhorns, right? Yeah. And Alexander Friedman, Rising Sophomore at Harvard University. So I'll give you guys a couple seconds, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah. All right, who's finished? Your initial results are in? Great. All right, Sarah, whenever you're ready.
Okay. We're going to start off with Alexander on the for side.
All right, thank you all so much for being here. This is such an important topic. The promotion of human rights and democracy abroad, it not only should be an American national interest, it really is an American national interest. Now, America was a nation founded on the principle that all people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And our founders believed that these rights were self-evident, that is, they applied to everyone. And over the past 70 years, the United States has been involved in the promotion of these rights across the world, leading to an unprecedented era in human history. We have never had so much peace in the world as we have had today. Never before had a single power been so committed to upholding the principles of human rights and democracy, allowing countless nations to grow and prosper. Today, however, many seem to have forgotten why the United States was committed to such principles. Blinkered and cynical, skeptics of American exceptionalism advocate for an isolationist America, uncommitted to her allies, disengaged from international affairs, and unwilling to square up to evil in this world. If we want America to remain safe and prosperous, these dangerous arguments must be banished. The stakes are too high for us to fall back on isolationism. Cowardice will not do. Effective internationalism is not only a force for good, it is also the only way for us to reassert our values on the international plane and to eliminate evil from this world. Now, the first argument that our detractors will make is that U.S. intervention often goes badly. This is false. History shows that American internationalism is overwhelmingly successful when done with the right motives and in the right way. Take the U.S. intervention in Kosovo in 1999. The awful Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic and his foul lieutenants organized the ethnic cleansing of over 270,000 Albanians in the former Yugoslav Republic of Kosovo. In response, the United States and her NATO allies bombed Milosevic out of Kosovo, leading to his downfall. He eventually died a traitor's death in The Hague during his trial for genocide and crimes against humanity. The campaign undoubtedly saved hundreds of thousands of lives and contributed to establishing a lasting peace in the region. There is no question as to the justification and effectiveness of this intervention. Other successful interventions include humanitarian and peacekeeping missions to East Timor, Sierra Leone, and the long-standing U.S. military presence in Europe and East Asia. In all of these cases, American and international intervention was and continues to be a serious and effective means of bringing about peace and deterring strife. America is a strong nation. It will not do to display cowardice in the face of evil. If we take our values seriously, we cannot shy away from tough solutions. On the other hand, the failure of the United States to intervene can be unconscionable. A harrowing example of the failure to intervene can be seen in the Rwandan genocide. U.S. officials were well aware of the systematic genocide as soon as it started. However, the United States felt that Rwanda held very little geopolitical significance, and thus opted to stay silent and inactive in the face of a very public genocide. Within 100 days of the start of this conflict, 800,000 men, women, and children of the Tutsi minority were brutally slaughtered. This genocide was not conducted by sophisticated military, but rather by ordinary civilians. Although the geopolitical gains of intervening would have seemed small, the United States could have quickly quelled this conflict and saved countless lives with very little risk. This tragedy highlights the danger of isolationist logic of only looking to our immediate interests. This failure to intervene sent a message to the world community that the United States permitted genocide. This is not something that we can stand by if we value the ideas under which we were founded. The final tool of American interventionism that our opponents will likely attack is the supposed ineffectiveness of sanctions. And yet, history once again shows that sanctions, time and time again, are successful in deterring countries from doing bad things. In 1975, the United States threatened sanctions on South Korea to prevent them from seeking to purchase a nuclear fuel reprocessing plant from France that could eventually be used to make nuclear bombs. South Korea eventually relented. Likewise, America actually imposed sanctions on Taiwan after learning that Taiwan was secretly developing nuclear weapons. Again, Taiwan eventually relented. In 1992, the United States and other Western countries stopped all humanitarian aid to Malawi in response to the increasingly brutal dictatorship of President Banda. By 1993, President Banda was forced to hold a referendum and transition to a multi-party system. By 1994, President Banda was ousted. In all of these cases and many others, sanctions or the threat of sanctions force countries to change their policies to be more in line with our values. The conclusion from all the above is that intervention works. We have the capability to promote our values across the world and secure peace. Be warned, the dichotomy between values and interests is false. If we forget our values, we forfeit our interests.
Okay. Daniel.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming here. I just want to start by saying that the debate today is not a debate about our values. It is a debate about the best way to realize them. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that governments are instituted among men to protect these rights, that democracy is the best government to do so. These are the truths that I am sure are as self-evident to us as they are to our opponents. The real question is, how do we realize these values, both for ourselves and our fellow nations? And it is clear that using military force and economic sanctions to promote democracy and human rights is not, as a general rule, the right way to do it. When we take democracy promotion and human rights to be fundamental aims of our foreign policy, as the resolution advocates, we too often find ourselves stuck in expensive and counterproductive quagmires, until domestic politics coerce us to withdraw. The resolution is flawed. First, in that it does not even reflect American values. As our founders understood, and as a great many religious and ethnic minorities know all too well, mere democracy means a government that can quickly turn to tyranny of the majority. De Tocqueville warned that in a democracy without strong republican traditions, a majority can wield unlimited power against a minority. It is for this reason that Christian Copts were so fearful when the Muslim Brotherhood won elections in Egypt. It is for this reason, fairly or not, that Syrian Christians are willing to support Bashar al-Assad, a brutal dictator who promises to stave off the prospect of potentially dangerous Sunni majority rule. Additionally, we have seen that democratic elections in unstable regions can give power to terrorist groups like Hamas, who won control of the Gaza Strip after elections held in 2006, and are able to maintain political power with promises of aid. We must remember that democracy alone is not an end. A stable constitutional democracy is. One ruled not by brute majority, but by law, by checks and balances, and by a culture of pluralism and tolerance that takes centuries to develop. Such institutions are virtually impossible to build in foreign countries. All that is needed is a list of names: Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Haiti, to prove that military intervention rarely leads to a stable liberal democracy. But military intervention to promote democracy is precisely what the resolution advocates. In reality, it takes years, decades, or even generations to create well-functioning democracies. Freedom is not imposed with the barrel of a gun. Rather, it must be built over a long period of time. Furthermore, the American people have rarely demonstrated interest in sustaining the cost in lives and money required for prolonged nation-building occupations. Iraq is a prime example. The United States succeeded in ousting Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and began the process of establishing a democracy. However, a war-weary group of voters back home meant that American forces did not have the time to oversee a democratic experiment that could have been decades in the making. The subsequent U.S. withdrawal of troops led to ISIS taking Mosul, a major oil city. The poor implementation of democracy has led to the Balkanization of Iraq, with Kurds seeking their own state, Shias influenced by Muqtada Sadr taking the most seats in government in the recent parliamentary election, and Sunnis crying foul at an election that they deemed was held before they could return to their formerly ISIS-occupied districts. Additionally, the economic sanctions that America prefers do not always achieve their lofty ends. There is an idea that targeting oligarchs or military firms will lead to political change. American policy towards Cuba shows that this can be tragically naive. Since 1962, strict U.S. embargoes have hampered the Cuban economy. In 2015, a year before President Barack Obama improved economic relations with the island nation, the take-home salary for most Cubans was around $20 a month, according to Richard Feinberg of the Brookings Institute. The Communist Party in Cuba showed no signs of leaving power. Unfortunately, though, sanctions are often a boon to local politicians. Ill-fated, feckless leaders can, with cause, claim that they are standing up to America's mission to bleed a nation of its power and starve its citizens. Putin's approval rating rose after sanctions in response to the invasion of Crimea. Cuba has survived over 50 years under the thumb of an oppressive communist regime. Nothing builds unity better than a common enemy. It is tempting to spread the many gifts and opportunities we have in America, but doing so by invading nations or strangling economies often does the most damage to civilians whose lives we seek to change. And yet the resolution, and making military and economic intervention to promote democracy a fundamental foreign policy objective, leads to precisely these results.
Thank you, Daniel. Rachel.
Previously, you heard Alexander describe the United States' moral obligation to protect human rights and promote democracy abroad, including through the use of military force and economic sanctions. However, many will argue that a foreign policy based on American values is necessarily at odds with American interests. I am going to demonstrate that this logic is short-sighted and ultimately puts American citizens at great risk. I will not assert that the United States should use sanctions and military intervention in all cases, but I will demonstrate that there are certain scenarios, namely massive human rights violations or conflicts that threaten the broader regional or international stability, in which the United States must be ready to utilize these tools. And indeed, it is in our national interest to do so. The United States clearly benefits from living in a peaceful and economically free and prosperous world.
the kind of environment created by promoting democracy and human rights. The strongest allies of the United States are fellow democracies, and every enemy of the United States has been an autocracy. Historically, transformations of governments into democracies has dramatically increased the United States' security and global stability. One merely has to imagine a world where Japan or Germany were still autocracies to understand the extent to which this statement is true. As Immanuel Kant argued in the 18th century, liberal democratic governments are inherently more peaceful than other forms. Theoretically, this argument rests on two key ideas. First, democracies will be less likely to wage war because conflicts and unrest threaten the peace foundational to the flourishing of their own governance. Moreover, democratic governments slow the process by which war is waged and bring more voices into the decision-making process. Second, democratic governments provide citizens an avenue for addressing grievances and enacting change, both of which lead to greater perceptions of personal agency and decreased threats of political instability and even extremism. Therefore, promoting democracy abroad helps to ensure a more peaceful world and thus greater prosperity for the United States. Statistical analyses of past and present governments have proven the validity of this theory. Despite this, our opponents will and have argued that past American involvement has been harmful to the nations we sought to assist. However, this notion has been proven false. After World War II, global economic output increased from 5.1 trillion to 70.2 trillion in just 70 years. This remarkable economic growth has directly improved the standard of living of American citizens and was only possible because of the widespread stability the United States provided through its liberty-oriented foreign policy, which led to free trade and open economic policies. The United States did not merely rely on soft power to create this liberal world order. Since World War II, military intervention has played a key role. The most dramatic success stories of U.S. involvement, Japan, Germany, and South Korea, are widely known, but they are still worth highlighting. In South Korea, per capita income in 1953 was just 1,500 US dollars. This was much poorer than Stalinist North Korea. Even though autocratic rule was in place for several decades, economic freedom led to great success in South Korea, which resulted in a liberal democratic government that is still in existence today. South Korea's alliance with the United States enabled its democratic reforms to occur in a largely authoritarian region. Today, per capita income has increased to 27,000 US dollars. South Korea continues to be a key ally of the United States, and this partnership enabled us to counter the influence of China in the Pacific. Aggregate data from nations allied with the United States proves what the example of South Korea suggests. Garrett Jones from George Mason University found that an increase in U.S. troops during a 20-year period reduced child mortality and increased life expectancy and increased economic growth. Even when controlling for GDP per capita, conflict, economic aid, the beneficial impact of American troops was still statistically significant. Therefore, it is clear that democracy promotion has created a more prosperous world, which has enabled great economic development and greater security and prosperity for Americans. Looking to the future, the United States should continue to be prepared to utilize military intervention and economic sanctions when needed. The principles on which the United States was founded do not cease to exist beyond our borders. We as Americans believe that all people should enjoy the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. American foreign policy must reflect these ideals, and, as I've demonstrated, is in our interest to do so.
Thank you, Rachel. And now we'll hear from Alex.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I'll start by briefly recapping some of my partner Daniel's points. He's pointed out that this resolution, while well-meaning, is fundamentally flawed. It advocates the promotion of democracy as a fundamental foreign policy objective, when the real desire should be constitutional democracy, with all its norms and institutions. In placing democracy promotion through military means at the center of our foreign policy, the resolution demands that we intervene frequently and generously to provide such institutions. But, as both reason and a host of interventions in countries from Iraq to Bosnia to Haiti all imply, trying to establish liberal democracy through military and economic coercion will rarely be successful. Opponents might try to counter, and indeed they have tried to, with the examples of South Korea, Germany, or Japan. These are countries where the United States intervened, and they ended up being healthy liberal democracies in the American image. But even a quick glance at their history undermines the notion that military intervention can create healthy democracy. Take South Korea. It is true that the Republic of Korea is a well-functioning republic today, corruption scandals aside, but we all too quickly forget that South Korea was a dictatorship until 1987. That is for over half of its existence. It was under the 22-year leadership of President Park Chung-hee, installed by military coup, that South Korea became the fantastically wealthy and modern nation it is today. It became a democracy only after the Korean people themselves demanded government reform, not after US troops did. This perfectly illustrates our point, that democracy must grow from local institutions, not foreign interventions. In other words, if you think South Korea is the model the US should use in state building, you should be against the resolution. Japan and Germany are even easier cases to dispose of. It is true that the United States built democracy in these countries successfully, but that was under conditions that are not present in any country today. Firstly, it can hardly be said that the US was replacing existing institutions with democracy, because those institutions were lying in ruins under the fragments of American bombs. Today, if the United States wishes to use military force to democratize a country, it would not be replacing the remains of discredited imperial regimes, but deep-seated traditions, policies, and politics. And despite their descent into militarism, Germany and Japan have far stronger history of liberal tradition than contemporary targets of US revision. The simple conclusion is that Korea, Japan, and Germany do not in any way support the notion that the United States can set up democracy in any old authoritarian country. Building a healthy liberal democracy, as we have seen, takes enormous time and effort, and military intervention to promote it is a fight against almost impossible odds. But military and economic intervention to promote democracy will not merely be ineffective, it will most likely weaken democracy and human rights in the countries targeted. Putin's heightened popularity after our sanctions on Russia are not the only example of this. In 1995, in the ironically named Operation Uphold Democracy, Bill Clinton sent troops to Haiti to support the lawfully elected president Jean-Bertrand Aristide, I'm sorry to everyone who speaks French, who had been prevented from entering office by military coup. But Clinton, not having the appetite to ensure that democracy actually took root, quickly withdrew troops. The result was another coup in 2004 and the stationing of a UN peacekeeping force in Haiti to uphold democracy, which is there to this day. Instead of a well-functioning government, these forces have brought corruption, disease, and, in the greatest irony of all, have been accused of human rights violations. The very tools that the resolution advocates for are all too often an acid to liberal democracy and human rights, not a tonic. Supporting its aims requires us to go into countries that we may be able to conquer, but will not be able to change. To be clear, we emphatically do not mean that there is no place for America on the world stage. We are not isolationists. Our involvement in NATO, our close relationship with Europe, and our efforts to spread free trade, for example, both help American interests and maintain stability throughout the globe. To give these up would not only be bad for the world, it would be bad for America. Neither are we saying that we should ignore democracy and human rights entirely. If there is a situation where the United States can intervene to promote democracy or human rights, and if the goal is clear, if the intervention is easy, and if we are not facing other pressing international issues, of course we should help. The point is that this is almost never the case. And basing our fundamental foreign policy interests, as the resolution states, is an incredibly unwise idea. This is, once again, not a debate about our values. We all hold dear of the same ideals. But military force and economic sanctions, blunt and even poisonous tools, should not be the default way to promote those ideals in other countries. If you love freedom, if you value democracy, if you cherish human rights, you should not support this resolution.
Okay, thank you. We are going to do about 10 minutes of moderator-led questions, and then we will open up to debate between our panelists. My first question is to Daniel and to Alex. You can both answer this question as you see fit. You've both claimed that American intervention may not or probably will not lead to democracy. But I'm wondering if you can comment on certain historical events such as the Rwandan genocide that Alexander brought up, how you can reconcile that belief when there is a very strong and burning moral imperative to intervene.
Well, the resolution says the promotion of human rights and democracy abroad should be a fundamental American national interest. In the case of Rwanda, it was a band of thugs wielding machetes who were leading this genocide. I think we can make as Alexander said, we are not isolationists. I think we can make a cause that showing up with a couple of guns to a knife fight would have dispelled this, and that would have not involved years of entrenched democracy building. That would have solved the crisis quickly, swiftly, and efficiently. So I do not think that we have to concede that we have to let massacres like Rwanda continue while we look the other way. What we are more concerned about is prolonged democracy building movements in countries that have leaders who we are not in agreement with, or political methods that we are not in agreement with, and tearing down stable countries to try and build democracy, which ultimately fails.
Do you want to add to that?
No.
Okay, on this side, to Rachel's point that American intervention and the spread of American democracy can help decrease the threat of extremism in a given country. In the years preceding 9/11, Osama bin Laden wrote extensively, basically airing very deep grievances towards the United States for American intervention in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, among other places. And it can be argued that these grievances manifested themselves in horrendous terror attacks, both in the years preceding 9/11 and 9/11 itself, when almost 3,000 Americans died on American soil. So my question is, at what cost do we intervene, and do we aim to spread American democracy and American values when there are dire consequences for Americans both abroad and on American soil when we choose to intervene?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I don't think that we should be basing our foreign policy on rhetoric employed by Osama bin Laden. Second of all, I do think that we do not take into account all of the causes of extremism when we look at terrorism in the Middle East. Extremism is often caused by a lack of economic opportunity and the absence of outlets to express grievances, resulting in perceived or actual lack of agency. Opposing corrupted governments and supporting democratic movements is a means to combat extremism, because ending the corruption of these brutal dictatorships decreases alienation and reduces extremism. This is not the rhetoric that these oppressive governments are going to employ when they're talking about the extremism happening within their own states. They are going to use a variety of means, including the intervention of Western states or Western values, to justify extremism, but we shouldn't only look at the strongest rhetoric to understand the root causes. We need to look at the reasons why individuals are radicalizing, and I don't think that Osama bin Laden's rhetoric explains that.
May I respond to that?
Wait, hold on. Osama bin Laden is a salty Islamist. Okay, he does not direct U.S. foreign policy. He is reacting against the successive U.S. foreign policy. When he seeks to attack the World Trade Center, the reason he's doing that is because he wants a world where women are oppressed, where there's no right to free speech. He is threatened by American values such as democracy, women's rights, and capitalism. These are values which we, and I hope that our opponents agree, are goods that should be spread throughout the world. And so when we have reactions against those values by people like bin Laden, that's not a reason for us to cower and hide. It's a reason to fight ever more strongly for our values.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in and ask you two questions. If, as you claim, intervention abroad is fundamentally in the American interest, I have two questions. Number one, why then is it so difficult for lawmakers to convince the American public that intervention is worthy of their blood and treasure? And historically, why have so many American interventions either been hidden from the American public or skewed in a way to mislead the American public, if this notion of American intervention is as fundamental as you claim?
Well, I don't think it is that hard to justify intervention when it really is justifiable. There was broad American support for the Iraq War in 2003. There was broad American support for the entry into World War II. These are both clear situations where the people have decided that we want America to pursue a interventionist foreign policy. And I just the promotion of human rights and democracy abroad, it's including through the use of military intervention and economic sanctions. That does not mean that we can't resort to diplomatic or cultural or social ways of promoting human rights and democracy, right? It's not, intervention and the promotion of these values isn't just through military force. I mean, we can do all sorts of ways to help these countries, and we do that every single day. Our foreign aid budget is several $billion, and this is how we promote our values, and that's always a good way. And people, I think there's a broad consensus in America that we should continue to do that. So it's not. I don't think it's true that it's hard for us to sell our, foreign intervention.
May I respond to that briefly?
I actually want to get to the next question, which I'm sure will cover your comment.
I hope so.
If you don't think that it's so difficult to sell intervention to the American public, I want to take us back to Barack Obama's infamous red line when Bashar Assad used chemical weapons on his citizens. Obama claimed that would be a red line, and if that red line were crossed, America would intervene. America did not intervene. So this is actually a question for both sides. Do you think that you can justify this lack of intervention given the crippling humanitarian and military crisis that has continued in Syria to this day? And can you comment on that failure of intervention if you claim that it actually is quite simple to convince the American public that intervening is the way to go? So do you want to start, Alex?
Yeah, sure. So one of the difficulties with talking about any military intervention is it's really hard to predict the future, especially in military combat, which is one of the reasons that we should really be very wary of intervening militarily anywhere. That's why it's a bad idea to make this a fundamental national interest. So it's hard to say what would happen in Syria if we intervened. So you have to look at, expert opinion. In the New York Times, Steve Simon, who was one of the directors of the National Security Council, and Jonathan Stevenson of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, said basically that Assad is way too propped up by Russia to allow us to have any success in intervening against him. Remember, Russia is an authoritarian state, right? That means that no matter how many forces American Democrats or Republicans, Americans that live in a democracy throw at him, Russia will always be able to do more because Russia is ruled by a single dictator. That implies that it's very unlikely that America will actually be able to muster the will and troops to do anything productive in Syria. So that's one way of looking at the situation.
Daniel, do you want to comment on that?
Additionally, we saw Trump when Assad crossed the red line by using chemical weapons again in 2018, Trump issued a surgical strike in coordination with the UK and France to try and take out some of those chemical weapons operations. And now we are here sitting in June of 2018, and I don't think Syria is getting any better. And furthermore, with the case of intervention in World War II and in Iraq, in World War II, the U.S. was isolationist before we were invaded by Pearl Harbor. We did not want to go and help our closest allies in Great Britain and France until we had an...
we should have.
Fair. Until we had an existential threat on American soil. And in Iraq, with the perception that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq under the control of Saddam Hussein, it was very easy to mobilize Americans to invade and take away that existential threat. Back when the U.S. needed to really do the dirty work of democracy building in 2008, when John McCain said we need to stay in Iraq to continue support, we withdrew troops after Barack Obama was elected. And what we saw after that was creating a power vacuum that was filled by ISIS, and it wasn't until July of 2017.
So is that not an argument in favor of intervention?
Well, that says that the American people are not willing to support the actual dirty work of intervention, and in America we are a representative democracy, and when we're making foreign policy, we have to vote on what the voter. We have to make our policies based on what the voters are going to decide, and they will clearly decide not to do the dirty work.
Can you guys comment on that point?
Yeah, is it all right if I address Iraq before going into Syria?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think that it's really easy, sitting where we are now, to idealize the pre-war conditions of Iraq, especially concerning Saddam Hussein's stability. But if you look at the means by which Saddam Hussein created that stability, it's really horrifying. Also, almost every Western intelligence community thought that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. So looking back at the decision we made, we have to look at the intelligence that we had then. Further, the true mistake, as Daniel alluded to in Iraq, was withdrawing troops too early. In 2008, U.S. forces had partnered with Iraqi forces and pushed al-Qaeda from Baghdad to Mosul. The U.S. was assisting Iraq with maintaining control of its major cities. When the U.S. decreased its involvement by withdrawing many troops, we left the responsibility of ensuring stability to Iraqi security, which lacked the key capabilities the United States had previously provided in a partnership, including intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Iraqi security lacked the ability to maintain stability without this assistance, and this led to an environment which extremism could thrive. Also, it's really hard to imagine what Iraq might look like had we not intervened, but I think that Syria might be an example of what Iraq would look like today if the U.S. had not been involved. And given the recent elections, though contested, have been primarily peaceful, and I think that on most accounts, Iraq is in a much better condition than Syria. Also, when looking at Syria, it's a really complex situation. At the beginning of the Syrian crisis, Assad was really smart, and he started releasing previously arrested Islamic fundamentalists in order to blur the line between rebel and terrorist. And so that made it really hard for the U.S. to intervene. I think if the U.S. had intervened earlier, that would have been it would have been a lot easier to identify who should be ruling the government after Assad and how to create that democracy.
Alexander, do you want to jump in at this point?
It does seem to me like our opposition seems to be arguing in our favor sometimes. They do seem to support intervention. They do seem to support, the promotion of human rights and democracy just generally. And I'm wondering really, why they think, I think they seem to have a quibble over the fundamental part of this resolution, right? The word fundamental. And their argument is that it's not a fundamental American national interest, but that we should do it most of the time when it's sensible anyways, which is what we're saying. We're not saying that we should intervene in every single situation, but when it's sensible, we should intervene, right? And so the reason why I think you need to include fundamental in this resolution is because we have to whenever there is a need to intervene, we should understand that is a fundamental, that we need to intervene there, and we can't dilly-dally around the argument and say, well, here's some isolationist arguments, here's some non-isolationist arguments. No, we need to be clear and concise. We need to be united as a nation when it comes to these matters.
May I respond to that? Mm-hmm. So actually, the word fundamental in the resolution is a crucial part of the resolution. If you just took out the word fundamental and said promoting democracy and human rights is a good idea and we should support it, that would not be an arguable debate, right? We can't go, this is being recorded right now. We can't come up here and say, oh yeah, we don't care about women's rights in Morocco, we don't care about democracy anywhere in the world. That's not the argument here. The argument is about how willing you should be to go in to support democracy and human rights in other countries. Our opponents have just admitted that should be the default assumption. And what we're saying is that is a very bad idea because most of the time it does not work. They have provided one example, Kosovo, which, by the way, it's a very disputed example. Whereas there's a whole list of examples where this did not work.
I'm sorry, but I want to get back to you mentioned in your speech that the examples of South Korea, Germany, Japan, you said that these weren't examples of successful U.S. promotion of human rights and democracy. You completely ignored the fact that in all of these countries for the past 70 years, a U.S. military presence has been guaranteeing their safety and security. You've been ignoring the fact that, in the early stages, yes, they were all more or less transitioning to authoritarian regimes.
Over half of its
democracy
history
takes a long time, and Americans stayed in those countries and promoted democracy throughout the period, and eventually those countries transitioned. This isn't an immediate thing that happens. The problem with Iraq was we didn't stay in Iraq. Had we stayed in Iraq for the same 70 years that we stayed in South Korea, maybe after 50, 60 years, it would be a stable democracy. These things take time, and you need to invest in these places before you give up and become an isolationist.
So, once again, we're not isolationists. If you think that we should have stayed in Iraq for 70 years, I think it's pretty clear where this debate is going, right? That's not
well, to counter that, we've stayed in Germany and Japan and South Korea because it's a beneficial mutual partnership. That's the kind of relationship that it would have turned into in Iraq, hopefully long before those 70 years. So I don't think he was saying that we should have occupied Iraq for 70 years.
So may I respond to their criticisms of my speech?
Sure.
Okay. So if you remember, what I said in my speech is not that this didn't work in South Korea or Japan or Germany. What I said is that these examples are completely inapposite to what we're doing today. Once again, there were 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan before we rebuilt their country. If you want to drop 2 atomic bombs on every single country before you turn it into a democracy, you can argue that.
Well, I don't
think it's a great idea, but you can argue that. Okay? So my point is just that those are not good examples to use in the present day. Those are not examples of where we intervene today. We intervene in countries that are not democracies, that are very strongly authoritarian and have very strong authoritarian institutions. Germany, Japan, and South Korea did not have those at the end of the Second World War because we had crushed them in a war.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And that war was for our national interests. It was to restore the balance of power in Europe. Does that make sense?
Okay, at this point, we're going to have both sides ask pointed questions in regards to the original speeches. So we'll start with Rachel, if you have specific questions on the 2 original speeches.
Okay, so in the resolution, it says that human rights and democracy abroad should be promoted through the use of military intervention and economic sanctions. In your speeches, I didn't hear either of you reference economic sanctions, and so I was wondering if you could talk about your opinions on that and whether or not you think that the United States should use economic sanctions to promote human rights as we did in South Africa, for example.
You should go first.
Daniel, you can take this one.
Well, first, I did address economic sanctions. I mentioned the economic sanctions in Cuba, which started in, I believe I said, 1962. And in 2015, Cubans were still making around $20 a month, and the Communist Party is still in power in Cuba despite regime change that has happened after Fidel Castro. So that's a place where we use the most aggressive economic sanctions against one of our neighbors, and I struggle to say that it has been successful. Additionally, the economic sanctions against Russia that the United States imposed in response to the invasion of Crimea, which again I think was more because of Russia's violation of the political rules and the world order rules as opposed to a violation of human rights, have not had the effects that we've wanted to. Emma Ashford of the Cato Institute mentioned that Russians who are individually targeted in the sanctions lost 3% of their wealth, while those who weren't saw their wealth decrease by 9%. So I think the idea to say that economic sanctions is simply a safe way to promote democracy is unfortunately a flawed one that we need to reconsider.
Okay, I want to respond to this question of Russia because it's weird. Every time some isolationists talk, they seem to have this admiration for Putin or Assad or whatever. And it's weird. You talk about Putin. Both of you talked in your speeches about Putin's popularity and how his popularity went up after the application of U.S. sanctions. Now, the fact that his popularity went up is not a function of the application of sanctions, but it's a function of the fact that Putin kills all his opposition. He kills all free journalists. There's no free press in Russia right now. There is no possibility for there to be any other leader except for Putin. And so when you go around with one of these polls asking people, who would you vote for, there's no option but Putin. Okay? When we applied sanctions on Russia, that was to cripple, it was not to target just the wealthy individuals, to cripple their economy so that they wouldn't be able to threaten, Western Europe and Ukraine in the way that they still do, right? If by your logic, if we lifted those sanctions, that would send a very clear signal to Putin that what he's doing is okay, that the international community doesn't care about the rule of law in Ukraine, and that America has absolutely no respect for the rules that it established after the Second World War.
Okay, Alex, do you want to respond?
Yeah, so sorry, I'm a bit confused. Firstly, if you say that Putin is the only option on these polls, then how did support for him go up? I'm confused. Shouldn't it have just stayed at an all-time high?
I mean, there's always
there are always changes because okay, all right. But secondly, so we're not isolationists. I wish I didn't have to repeat this. If we support the international world order, we feel like it has valuable results for both America and the world at large. For example, promoting free trade helps Americans, helps promote democracy. It's nowhere in this resolution. It's a great idea, right? That's not what we mean to argue about. So if by lifting sanctions on Putin, that's going to basically encourage him to do more bad things, then maybe we shouldn't do that. But the point is that the sanctions actually probably improved his position. That's all that we're saying. Now, on the point of South Africa, which was in the original question, South Africa is, as you might guess, also a place where sanctions were not necessarily successful. A very venerable study by Philip L. Levy, who's a professor at Yale, said that the role the sanctions played in the eventual demise of apartheid was probably very small. If you look at other studies of the effects they had, they also increased the popularity of the Afrikaans government in South Africa after they were implemented. So in South Africa, yet again, it's very strange to say that sanctions were an unequivocal success.
Go ahead.
I have a question for you guys. And so you mentioned Putin and his, murder of journalists and the way how he has cracked down on backlash and how that could be a reason for intervention. So another example of a country that has done this in equally terrifying fashion has been Turkey. In the Gezi Park protests in 2013, 8,000 Turkish citizens were injured, 104 had serious head injuries, 11 lost their eyes, and there were 8 deaths, including 4 that have been linked to police violence. Additionally, Twitter and Wikipedia have been shut down. Over 110,000 public officials were dismissed in 2017 without due process, and media outlets, associations, foundations, private hospitals, and educational establishments have been shut down by government decree. And the U.S. has an air base in Incirlik, Turkey. do we need, in addition to that, the U.S. and Turkish troops have been on opposite side of the front lines in Syria in the past 2 months. So, according to this resolution, with democracy promotion and human rights as a fundamental interest of American foreign policy, do we also need to invade Turkey and get into a multi-front war in Syria?
Well, again, I think you're misunderstanding. This doesn't mean that we want to invade every single country that's not democratic. It means we want to promote democracy and human rights as a fundamental part of our foreign policy. So yes, in Turkey we should be promoting democracy, we should be empowering activists, we should be, encouraging the Turkish government to stop doing these repressive things. Military action is not the correct response to that. It is the correct response in some cases, like Rwanda, like Kosovo, but there are other means. So by painting us as, raging neoconservatives who just want to invade every single country, you're again doing the entire resolution and to ours a disservice, because that's not what a sensible person would do.
Wait, sorry, so you don't think we should put sanctions on Turkey for doing all these?
I think it's definitely
things?
a possibility we can do.
Okay.
Rachel, do you want to respond?
I was just going to reassert what Alexander was saying, that just because the United States has within its capability the use of military intervention and economic sanctions doesn't mean that we have to use them every time. However, I do think much of American soft power is created on the threat of economic sanctions and military intervention, and so if we create a precedent where we will never do those things, I think the United States will lose the influence it has in the broader global sphere. And that leads into my question for you guys, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask, if the United States were to withdraw its influence in even just through the use of military intervention and economic sanctions, which would probably lead to a decrease of influence in other ways, are you worried that other more authoritarian governments, which may not share the same concerns for human rights, will fill that void, namely Russia, as we've kind of seen in Syria, or China, or other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, that is a very big concern on our side. The concern that the U.S. may not very well be able to maintain its status as a world superpower in the coming years, and that they'll be replaced by countries like China or Russia. And that's precisely one of the reasons we're so hesitant to engage so much in these very small interventions in very small countries, like Bosnia, for example, when we have really, really big issues with China and Russia. Again, we're not isolationists. We really think that the U.S. has a key role to play on the world stage. Right? Again, that would be a very difficult debate if we were supposed to be isolationists. It's not what the resolution is about, right? It's about something a bit more stringent than that. And actually, that's actually one of the disadvantages of this resolution. That if you're willing to let us commit troops to much more minor interactions, that distracts both financially and just in terms of our attention from competition with other rising powers. This is not the 1990s anymore. The U.S. is not the premier power on the world stage. We heard, I think yesterday from someone who talked about the threats of a rising China and a rising Russia. The only reason we can debate this resolution is because we're assuming that the U.S. is the unipolar power. That's not necessarily the case, and it's very dangerous to just say that we can go around the world. Again, not always intervening militarily, but presuming, because it's in our fundamental interests, that we should intervene militarily, when we very well likely should be concentrating on our great power relationships with Russia and China.
Okay, so I'm going to have Daniel respond. You two will respond briefly, and then we will go to our 2-minute break.
I actually have a quick question. Is it all right if I ask that?
Go ahead.
So moving on, Rachel, you mentioned that democratic governments bring more voices. I would argue that that's not true, that even in America, we saw in our most recent elections, our democratic elections brought Republican control of the presidency, of both chambers of Congress, and now of the Supreme Court, and of most agencies. Additionally, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the leader of Egypt, is very much a military dictator. There is not a whole lot of argument about that. And he has support of Copts, he has support of Copts because they felt like they would be left out of democracy and that the Muslim Brotherhood could control.
Okay, let's give him a chance to
Sure.
respond.
Additionally, Assad has a coalition of Alawites, Shias, Yazidis, and Christians under his support. So what is your argument? I would like to hear you respond to the question that how can democracy in such an ethnically fractured country truly bring out more voices and not just lead to tyranny of the majority?
Okay, well, first of all, when you're talking about the United States, it almost sounded like you would rather there be an authoritarian government in the U.S., and so that, I think, is a little concerning. But then moving on from that, in the case of Egypt and Syria, yes, Assad does have a coalition of Christian minorities that support him. But I think even given that, we can't act as though Christians in Syria are treated well. It's already an authoritarian government, and their real concern is not of democracy, but rather a fundamentalist Islamic government taking Assad's place. That is not what the U.S. will support. And so I think that in a democracy, a wider variety of voices are brought in than any other government. It may not be an equal representation, and while that isn't a positive thing, I am pressed to think of another system that gives them any greater voice. And further, Syria, you said you called a democracy an oppression of a majority, or that you said that in a democracy, oppression of the majority could occur. Syria is an oppression of a minority, and so in the end, it's still an oppression. People are still being oppressed, and so I think in your argument, you're kind of idealizing the current state of minorities in Syria when really they have no rights either.
Okay, let's hear something from Alexander.
Yeah, I think our opposition is delusional if they think that democracy decreases representation. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay. On that note, we are going to take a 2-minute break, and then we will hear our concluding arguments. And also, if you are a raging neocon, that's okay. It really is okay. Okay, we are going to wrap up our debate. If we can get everyone's attention. We are going to start with Alexander. Alexander will have 2 minutes to wrap up his debate, and then we will go on to Daniel.
Right, so I want to conclude by repeating a few of the things that our opponents said over the course of this debate. First one was they want the U.S. to play a key role on the world stage. Second one was they wish that the U.S. had intervened earlier in World War II. The third is they want the U.S. to compete with China and Russia. The fourth is they want to keep sanctions on Russia. And the fifth is that we should have intervened in Rwanda. Now, that to me sounds a lot like they think that promoting human rights and democracy is a fundamental national interest. I don't know if they're going to, again, the key point of this debate is where our priorities lie. Do our priorities lie with upholding human rights and democracy? If you think yes, then you're in favor of this. If you don't think that our priority is to uphold human rights and democracy, then you're against. Our opponents have demonstrated through many of the things they said that they do seem to think that human rights and democracy is a priority. So I'm still confused as to why they are against this debate, and I really hope that in their final statements they will clarify this for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Daniel, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Yes. So, again, we'd like to hammer home this word fundamental. And taking democracy and human rights to be of fundamental interest in U.S. foreign policy abroad means that it is unacceptable that the U.S. has an airbase in Turkey, unacceptable that the U.S. has alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, and unacceptable that we aren't doing everything we can to combat countries like Turkey, even if it means us losing our military presence there. Additionally, democracy can be dangerous. Alexis de Tocqueville warned of this so clearly. In the U.S., we are fortunate to have a country where democracy can protect minority rights. And in countries like Syria, where ethnic fracture is so strong, and we are making international decisions based on arming the Kurds or certain militants of different ethnicities, it is very difficult to take that and then create a robust, pluralistic democracy. That is a dangerous thing that we must take into consideration. Additionally, we cannot invade every fractured republic that we come across. It is just too difficult. And ultimately, we must fight for the stability that we fought for in South Korea in very, very, very flawed circumstances that ultimately led to the democracy we have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. We will go to Rachel.
Okay. I'm sad that we keep coming back to the word fundamental, but I would just like to assert that from our opening statements, we said that the ability for the United States to use military intervention and economic sanctions should be a tool at our disposal that we are ready to use. It does not mean that we invade every undemocratic government. We have never said that, and we have been arguing against that. Like any other policy tool, military intervention and economic sanctions must be used after careful calculations. Further, if you look at the aggregate data of countries where the United States has been involved, where we've had troops, it has showed broad successes. And one of the things that our opponents keep bringing up is that the United States should be using other means to promote democracy and human rights abroad. And much of the way that the United States does that today, outside of military intervention and economic sanctions, is through the use of soft power and influence and even threatening the use of these two tools. And so my concern is that if the United States were to take these off the table, our soft power would be baseless. And so I wonder how the United States is going to keep promoting these things if there is nothing that we're doing to back up our claims. And this goes back to Sarah's earlier question about the red line, when Obama said that there would be a red line in Syria, and if it was crossed, we would intervene, and we didn't, it sent a message to dictators that we really don't care that much about the use of chemical weapons, and it's going to be iffy whether or not we will do anything about it. And it sent a message to burgeoning democracies that we are not necessarily going to be committed to them as we claim. And so I think that if we say that we promote human rights and democracy abroad, we have to be willing to use military intervention and economic sanctions some of the time in order to actually promote these ideals.
Thank you, Rachel. And finally, we will hear from Alex.
Thank you for staying through the debate tonight. I guess it's just important to clarify what the debate is about. And again, I want to emphasize that the important thing is that this debate would not be debatable if we were simply saying something like the U.S. should keep human rights and democracy in mind when it conducts its foreign policy. What this debate is about is whether or not it should be a presumption of the United States that it should use military and economic force in conducting its foreign policy. Someone disagrees, though. I just don't know how this debate would be arguable otherwise. The point we were trying to make is that in really, really extreme cases like Rwanda, where basically it's very clear that even if the U.S. sent someone with a BB gun, that the people with the machetes would probably stop killing people, that's a fine case. But we can't base our foreign policy on outliers. We need to base our foreign policy on the normal course of events. And what we are saying is that in the normal course of events, it's unwise to make the promotion of democracy and human rights a fundamental value of the United States, because that inevitably gets us into conflicts that we can't get out of. There are many, many times where we should not have intervened, where we disagree with the foreign policy of the United States. For example, intervening in Iraq, intervening in Afghanistan, intervening in Bosnia. These were all things that ended badly for the U.S. We're not trying to just try and grab the resolution for ourselves by saying, well, we should do everything the same. The resolution pushes us to go very far in what we do to promote human rights and democracy. All we are saying is that we should be internationalists, but for different reasons. We should be internationalists to promote the fundamental interests of America, which oftentimes, like in the promotion of free trade, align with promoting democracy and human rights. What we are saying is that we should not make it a fundamental part of our calculus to promote democracy and human rights for their own sake, because inevitably, when we do that, that leads to quagmires, as we said in the original speech, that it's really difficult for the U.S. to get out of. I hope that elucidates the main difference between the opposition, between our opposition and us in this debate. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Great.
Can I say one quick thing? Thank you all for coming. It's really awesome that you came to see the hard work of my friends. I know my questions as a moderator were absolutely profound, but it didn't take me as much time to write my questions as it did my peers to prepare for this debate. So thank you for showing your support for my peers, and you all did an amazing job.
Thank you.
Oh, and now, whether you are a raging neoconservative or an isolationist, we want to know what you think now. So please note the URL is slightly different at the end. I guess this was already taken. So you have to do FTP and then 2, but spell out 2. All right. They are being delivered by hand. Courier mail. Okay. Wow. All right. So we're going to start with income inequality. Can someone... Okay.
I can read it.
Hold on. Do I have
The what?
Just want to go back to the exact solution. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so for income inequality is a serious threat to the United States economy and society. In the opening poll, 47% agreed, 44% disagreed, and 7.8% was undecided. In the closing poll, 38.36 agreed, 60.27 disagreed, and 1.137 were undecided. So the team arguing against the resolution, Matthew and Reagan, made a gain of around 16%. So congratulations. All right.
Spoons didn't win.
Foreign policy. The promotion of human rights and democracy abroad, including through the use of military intervention and economic sanctions, should be a fundamental, bold, italicized, underlined, American national interest. Okay. 59% agreed with this statement in the opening. 29.5 disagreed. And 11.5 were undecided. In the closing, after thoughtful deliberation, 35% agreed, 54% disagreed, and about 10.5 were undecided. So once again, the con in the resolution, Alexander and Daniel gained about 25%. So congratulations to both teams.
Wait, who was the better moderator?
I think you. There was no vote.
It was definitely
It'd be
me.
better that way.
It was definitely me.
Thank you all again for coming and for staying through a fun but a bit long experience. And again, if you'd like to learn more about AEI, please don't hesitate to talk to the staff afterwards. We'd love to find ways to get you more involved. And I will see the Kagan and U groups bright and early tomorrow morning at Thurston at those respective times. Good night, everyone.